So let me give you a little introduction from a piece that Grace wrote right the way back in March, right at the beginning of the crash, the crisis in the UK. No one could have foreseen that within a year, the global economy would fall into perhaps the deepest recession in modern history through this global spread of a deadly disease. The coronavirus pandemic is one of those rare things, a genuine exogenous shock generated by nature rather than the internal contradictions of global capitalism. The economic shock caused by the virus, however, is interacting with pre-existing vulnerabilities of the global economy. After a decade of slow growth, surging debt levels, and rising inequality, the world has rarely been worse prepared for a new recession. The recovery from the 2008 financial crisis was characterized above all by stagnation of incomes, productivity, and investment, and multiple overlapping vulnerabilities emerged. 5 interrelated storm clouds stood out to me in 2019, Grace writes in this article: slowing growth and rising debt in China, global monetary tightening, the unresolved Eurozone crisis, global trade instability, and rising private debt in the global north. With hindsight, it is clear that the stagnation of the last 10 years represented the death knell of the era of financialisation, which collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions in 2008. This year, we have witnessed the birth of its replacement, state monopoly capitalism. Those on the left have few reasons to rejoice about the rise in state spending currently taking place across the global north. The legacy of this crisis will be the concentration of economic and political power in the hands of a tiny oligarchy composed of senior politicians, central bankers, financiers, and corporate executives. So I'm going to bring in Grace on this. I know that was a long intro, but this is like quite an intense and big claim here. And that's what I want to start off with. Free market capitalism, financialization is dead. Politics can no longer be separated from economics. These are pretty bold claims made in relation to your book, sometimes by yourself and sometimes by others writing about it. Can that really be true? Isn't it more likely that, as Professor Wolff once joked, that Marxists have predicted 10 out of the last recessions, and this is just socialist hyperbole bordering on wishful thinking? We're in the midst of a massive global recession, but financial capitalism has found a way out before. Will it not find out a way out again?
I think we have to distinguish here between kind of short-term conjunctures and crises and long-term structural trends within capitalism. Now, when I said that what we're going through represents the kind of the era of a kind of death knell of financialization, I don't mean to say that the kind of trends that emerged during the era of the kind of peak of financialization, which is broadly between the 1980s and 2008, aren't important anymore, because of course they are. What I mean to say is that there are a set of other trends that have emerged through a process of, I suppose, adaptation of the system to sets of overlapping both kind of conjunctural and structural crises, so kind of short-term immediate crises and longer-term structural crises. And really what we've been seeing is a kind of deep transformation in the nature of global capitalism since the financial crisis of 2008. And in my previous book, Stolen, I look at how that crisis itself emerged from a set of changes that had taken place in the global economy that you can really situate in the transition from the kind of post-war Trente Glorieuses period, the 30 kind of golden years of capitalism that emerged after the Second World War, to the kind of neoliberal era, and all the kind of internal contradictions associated with that led to the crisis of 2008. I think what's quite important is to recognize the not just kind of short-term economic and financial impact of the crisis of 2008, but also the longer-term structural impact that the collapse of a particular form of resolution to a previous crisis, which was, you know, the emergence of this big bubble in finance and real estate. When that burst, there was the need to come up with a new set of solutions to this longer term problem of stagnation in capitalism, to this longer term problem of the kind of absence of profitable investment opportunities. Now, previously, you'd seen, obviously, you know, the kind of deregulation of the finance sector, big bubble in the real estate sector, the dramatic growth of financial globalization, so money kind of moving all over the world, which all of these things were obviously very much interlinked, all as mechanisms basically to try and deal with this central problem, this structural problem of the absence of investment outlets for kind of investment capital, whilst trying to kind of make sure that the way that was dealt with didn't fundamentally shift the balance of power that exists within capitalism between workers and owners. And I think what we're seeing today is a new set of responses to that longer term structural crisis, but which have emerged in the context of this crisis that happened in 2008. And the obvious one there is the massive amount of money creation that we've seen from central banks in the period since 2008, which has served to basically prop up asset prices, so house prices, also kind of equities in certain stock markets, and also facilitate things like corporate concentration, so rising monopoly power, and thereby helping to kind of basically give it a kickstart to growth, but one which mainly benefits those at the top of the income spectrum, and indeed one that mainly benefits big business and to a certain, though lesser extent, big finance. There you go. I thought it was my fault, but
no, it's me trying to be a good boy and stay muted whilst you were laying down some knowledge. So you talk about the inherent contradictions that led to the 2008 crisis, and then the ones that come from here, which is this pumping of money into the economy, which is largely filtered up and therefore has not created inflation, but has seen value of houses and the assets of the wealthy go up in value. You then talk about state monopoly capitalism and that being something that is this next phase, or this way of resolving the problems. What will that look like? What is that? And how does it resolve any problems?
Yeah, so I mean, this is actually a term that Lenin came up with a long time ago, over 100 years ago. But he was remarking on trends that have become much more deep-rooted in the modern era. And this idea of state monopoly capitalism, again, which was taken forward by Marxists in the post-war period as well, used to describe what was going on there in terms of like rising corporate power, has again taken on a kind of quite new and much deeper form, I think, in the modern era. And what it's really characterized by is a kind of growing concentration of power, in the way that I mean it anyway, and to a certain extent in the way these other authors meant it. There are all sorts of kind of overlapping interpretations as to what is meant by this term state monopoly capitalism. But in the way that I'm using it in this book, I'm referring to a kind of growing concentration of political and economic power in the hands of a kind of small elite, as I referred to it in that piece. So, effectively, on the one hand, you see the emergence of very big and very powerful monopolistic corporations. So you can obviously see that today with the rise of the big tech companies, but it's also something that is a much longer standing trend and extends into all sorts of industries. You obviously have the kind of concentration of finance, which takes a step forward after the crisis when a lot of banks obviously go bust. And you have a concentration of power in the hands of a particular set of states. So that's the wealthiest states in the global system. And then within the state, you have the concentration of power within certain industries and certain like parts of the state apparatus. So central banking is really, really important on this front, because from the 1990s, it's no longer democratically controlled. So it's controlled just by technocrats. And this, is a really important foundation to facilitate the emergence of what we have today, which is basically central banking oriented towards propping up asset prices in the interests of the wealthy, basically because there's no democratic accountability there. And that, I think, is the really important thing to mention, is that we live in this kind of very centralized form of capitalism where there's a great deal of power concentrated in a small number of hands. And that's what really I mean when I say that we're kind of seeing the death of the free market, because the kind of ideal scenario portrayed by the average kind of mainstream economists sees there being lots of kind of small producers that are unable to kind of interact with each other, a small state, and broadly speaking, kind of a fairly like anarchic market conditions. Whereas today we have, very little of that. We have much more market concentration, much greater levels of collusion, of collaboration, of state power, of financial power, of corporate power. And what this really does is it kind of serves to undermine a lot of the reasons why the economists rely on to tell us that capitalism works as a system. And you can see that both in terms of the kind of increasingly frequent, both short-term and long-term, deeper crises that capitalism is subject to, but also, just the massive amounts of waste and irrationality generated by the system. The fact that we can't stop producing, even as the commodities that we're producing, many of them are completely unnecessary for human flourishing, and are also kind of leading to the collapse of the environment.
So when you describe the sort of the elite, this state monopoly capitalism you outlined there, big states, sort of what we'd call probably imperialist states, right? Who've had empires or have empires, and financial sectors, big monopoly companies. People would probably recognize those as the elite all along. Or are you saying this is kind of like this is a new thing? And more importantly, if we can see the elite, that's one thing. But what does the crises in this change mean for ordinary Britons? I'd like to get into a couple of details on that, but just, if you can maybe answer a couple of questions there, which is one, what is different about this elite? Is it just that their power has become more concentrated? Because it seems to me that those sectors always seem to have a lot of control in how society worked. And secondly, what does that mean for us?
I think there's two trends to mention on the first front, which is to say there's been a concentration within the elite, and also a shift in the balance of power between the elite and everyone else. And those two things obviously go hand in hand. So on the one hand, there are just a smaller number of corporations that control a much greater proportion of total output. And that picture becomes even more pronounced if you look at the way in which basically a lot of consumer-facing brands are ultimately owned by one or two large conglomerates. And then if you look at the level beneath that, obviously there are a couple of very important large financial institutions that are the majority shareholders or very significant shareholders in a lot of big corporations. And so the ownership structures, again, become much more concentrated. So kind of corporate power has become much more concentrated. Obviously, the same can be said of financial institutions and financial interests and power. And then again, the point I mentioned about the kind of changing nature of power within the state. So the shifting of state power to render it kind of less democratically accountable. All of these things are quite important in explaining the, I think, I don't want to say it's necessarily a qualitative shift that you can identify happens at one particular moment, but it's certainly a long-term quantitative change that I think we are moving into an era that requires a deeper and more profound analysis of what's going on. And I mean, these trends were all visible and have been visible for a long time. As I said, there are economists, Lenin was writing about 100 years ago, economists like Barron and Sweezy were writing about it in the 60s. C. Wright Mills was writing about kind of elite power and corporate concentration in the 60s. And yeah, I mean, so, I don't think necessarily we're seeing a kind of structural change in the kind of nature of the people who control the system. But what we are seeing is the concentration of power to such an extent that it generates a set of problems with the functioning of the system. And that's, I think, where the second part comes in, which is, what does this mean? Yeah, very elegantly.
Yeah,
coming into the next part of your question.
Really put together, because we've got two guests as well. When we're going to
Sorry,
be
I'm talking too long. I always do this. You feel free to interrupt me.
It's like, this is what we need. This, brevity is a killer sometimes of understanding something. But we've got two guests who are going to be speaking on disability in one hand, and also Chile, which was, the birthing place, really the testing ground of neoliberalism. So it'd be great if you can speak to those two things, as well as talking about wages, small businesses. I know a lot of people are really worried about small businesses because of the crisis, especially in the entertainment industry. We talk about that a lot, and in the leisure sectors, these seem to have no provision from state. So even though there's a concentration of power, there doesn't seem to be any support for those sectors. What does life look like for us in those areas?
Yeah. So rising monopoly power has a whole host of really negative connotations for the rest of the economy. So first, when you have a higher level of monopoly power, you tend to have high levels of inequality. Obviously, a lot of firms that are monopolists are also monopsonists in the sense that they're the single buyers in an area. So they have a lot of power basically to be able to determine wages. Also, monopolies are often not very good at investing in order to kind of both develop and introduce new technologies. So the pace of innovation can slow, which again has implications for the potential of the economy. There's also obviously this massive issue of kind of the interlinkages between corporate power and political power, which mean that monopolies are often much better able to kind of exert their influence over the political process as well. So all of these things can lead to kind of rising inequality, and also like longer term trends like stagnation, really, which is the combination of a rising amount of profits going to those at the top without really any kind of real investment outlets that will kind of absorb those profits, and that's particularly associated with these issues of innovation and inequality. So it kind of generates these stagnation trends. In terms of wages, I mean that very much comes into it as well. The interesting thing here is about the relationship between this trend of monopoly power and that of state spending and state power. And what I think is interesting is that while monopoly power, I think, does tend unambiguously, along with financialisation, which is a trend I analysed before, to kind of increase the power of bosses over workers or of owners over workers. The state is more ambiguous in that sense, because state spending can be used to really push either way. What we really have to look at is the class dynamics that underpin what happens within the state. And that's really important because, I mean, the British state has always been pretty responsive to the influence of the very highly organized, internationalized, financialized capitalist class in the UK, kind of typified by the power of the City of London, for example. And that often means that state power is very much oriented towards supporting the interests of not even just the kind of big business class, but actually like a kind of very extractive rentier class of financiers, of real estate moguls, of that sort of stuff. In America, you can see more obviously how the power of the US government is used to support the interests of big business definitively, whether that's through kind of opening up new markets abroad, or whether it's through just direct subsidies, which are often given by the state to lots of different companies. The other thing, of course, is the use of central bank power, which obviously through quantitative easing has really reinforced a lot of these trends and basically made it really, really cheap for big businesses to borrow money very, very cheaply and then use it to kind of to boost their own profits. So all of these things just create these deep-seated trends towards, I suppose, what's the really important thing here, which is this the exacerbation of this imbalance of power between people who work for a living and people who own all the stuff. And I think that's where this issue and these trends link into what other guests are going to be talking about. I mean, Chile is an exceptional case, and we could talk about that for an entire show, just in terms of the dynamics of imperialism. But I think, when it comes to the fact that disabled people are probably going to be, I mean, they are already being disproportionately hurt by this crisis, but will continue to be. It's again because the power of the state is something that is increasingly captured by this small elite and used to further their interests rather than to help the majority, or even to be used in the way that the majority would like. I'm sure most people would actually want disabled people to have more support, but because we have this pattern of just rising, what I call corporatocracy, that doesn't seem to happen.
So actually, yeah, we brought in Steph, and I will bring in Nick, and we'll let this section go over a little bit because it's worthwhile. And we're coming to the end of the year. It's almost like a review show of the year. This is where we are, and this is where we might be heading. But we will end on a positive note of what we can do, by the way. But Steph, do you have any questions or thoughts on what Grace has been outlining here?
Yeah, I had a question. It wasn't actually so much about disability. It was more about COVID. So the UK is one of the worst performing countries in the developed world in terms of our economy and the number of deaths we've had. So there's clearly there's a lot of scope for doing things better. And I was just wondering if you had comments on how we could have done things better this year, but also what we perhaps should have been doing in the last 10 years that would have meant that when a crisis like COVID came along, because crises are always going to happen, even if we don't know specifically what they are, what should we have been doing in the last 10 years so that when a crisis came, we were able to get through it without the level of harm that we've seen this year.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. And I think we have to distinguish between what would be rational for a particular system based on an analysis of the kind of needs of society and what ends up being politically feasible. Because obviously, I think, there's a very strong case, a very obvious case to say that it would have been much more rational to spend more money as a society on boosting public health infrastructure, on supporting local government to expand various different forms of social care, to put more money into the NHS, to put more money into prevention, to put more, to not basically subject disabled people to the unbelievable horrors that they've been subjected to over the last 10 years in preparation for what has a crisis that has harmed them so very, very much. And actually, support the the ability of people, of working class people, of disabled people, of people who are often excluded from the wider economy to live decent lives. All of those things would be rational things for us as a society to do, both because, a lot of them would actually support our capacity to produce more over the long run. And just because, if we came together democratically and decided what kind of society would we want to live in, I think most people would choose that over the one that we have now. But then there's this question, as I said, of the political imperatives. And that's really where the issue comes down to. And on that front, there is just not working people are just simply not organized enough to be able to resist the consistent encroachments of their rights and of the support that is provided to them by the state, particularly over the last kind of 40 or so years, where there's been this kind of sustained attack on the power of working people. And it's been easiest for the state to attack kind of things that are seen as kind of minoritarian, right? So the rights of disabled people, to attack the care system, things like children's social care, where you've had unbelievable cuts to some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And because, the state is responding to the balance of power in society, where it's deciding where resources are going. And because we haven't had this movement that's been able to resist that, it only really started to emerge after the financial crisis, when this stuff was already underway. I think that's been the real problem, which is why, I think that the focus has to be always, when we're talking about these issues, not just on saying, well, it would be rational for us to do this. Of course it would be. It'd be rational for us to live in a profoundly different society than one we do now. It's really a question of building power to figure out how we can get there.
On that point, Nick, building power and stuff, that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit later in relation to your film. Do you have any points in regards to what Grace has been outlining there? Any lessons to be learned from Chile or anything like that before I come to the very final question and we move on to the next segment? Oh, you're on mute as well. Yeah, we're all trying to be good, aren't we?
The old classic. I was saying that was really interesting, Grace. Thanks. Obviously, you guys were talking about the kind of the incompatibility between capitalism and democracy, and that was probably one of the most famous cases of that. Obviously, is the 1973 military coup in Chile. As you've probably seen in October last year, so just over a year ago, Chileans rose up in a huge kind of grassroots mobilization against what essentially was the Pinochet-imposed neoliberal model, which had been imposed first through a military coup and then through extreme levels of state violence towards trade unionists, political opponents, everyday people who opposed these profound changes. Obviously there's a reason why Naomi Klein chose it as a case study for the shock doctrine. But I was just wondering, this kind of huge backlash, which came very much from the grassroots and was outside of political parties, has a year later taken Chile far forward. And I was just wondering what you think are the potential for similar kinds of mass backlashes, particularly in the post-COVID landscape against the neoliberal model. We're seeing mass transfer of wealth again, even more from public or from the state to private interests. The New York Times today with its big splash on the Tories funding to their cronies, their mates. I was just wondering what you thought of the potential for a similar thing to ever occur, if only in Britain or elsewhere in Europe, or perhaps the US, outside of Latin America, I'm referring to, in more kind of other countries that have really suffered under the capitalist model.
I mean, to be honest, I am of the view that the kind of most likely source of a real ruptural form of resistance to the existing model of capitalism that we have today is most likely to come from somewhere in the global south. And there are lots of reasons that I think that, partly the dynamics of imperialism, which doesn't just mean kind of going over and invading different countries. It means that, to a certain extent, the living standards that the average person has in the West are, at least to some extent, mirrored by the kind of impoverishment of large sections of the global South. So in terms of the kind of objective conditions, as Marx would have discussed, as to the formation of a class that would have an interest in resisting and kind of overthrowing the capitalist system, I can only really see that emerging in the global South. In terms of what could happen in the global North, I think what's interesting here is actually an observation that was made by Tocqueville rather than by Marx, which was that what often precedes revolution is not necessarily a kind of objective, absolute impoverishment. It's a decline in living standards. That's what people react to very, very strongly, is thinking, I'm looking ahead and my life doesn't seem like it's going to get any better. Even if that doesn't mean, they're going to be completely and utterly, desperately poor, thinking that their lives and their children's lives aren't going to get better is quite something that people tend to resist. And I think that's something that we are increasingly seeing in the global North for all the reasons I've kind of outlined. And in fact, my generation, millennials, are the first generation in modern history likely to be worse off than their parents. In that sense, I think there is room for a kind of countervailing political movement in the global North, but there are so many, as we've seen in the last 20 years, so many forces that are organized against us. The solidarity of the ruling class against any form of even minor social democratic reform is so huge that we're going to need to spend a lot of time building that up. And I think actually making sure that socialists in the global North are allied with movements in the global South who are trying to do the same thing from a very different standpoint.
Excellent. Well, that's a beautiful way to end, because I was going to ask you what we should be looking to do, and I know there's more answers in the book, so please check out Grace Blakeley's book, The Corona Crash, and links are in the description. You can find it. It's on Verso. It's at other places as well. Link is in the description. Check it out.